Hi everyone, Jimbo J-Tech back with a new video here on Sonic Academy about pressure. It's a single concept in dance music which I employ all the time for either creative effect or to make sure that I'm not overcooking my track. It's something that I think a lot of up-and-coming producers have never really sort of considered when they're making their mix decisions and when they're putting their track together. So in this video I'm going to talk to you a little bit about knowing when you've overstepped the bounds of how far you can push certain sounds, and also identifying when there's room to push those sounds a little bit harder. So let's dive right in. I'll show you a few tips. In the previous video, we talked about flowing your sound towards more pleasing sounding frequencies for the purposes of vibrating air and creating a sense of gravity. This is a wonderful tool and one of the first techniques that I use to correct things in a record. Today I want to talk a little bit about pressure. And pressure is an interesting attribute of all music. It's something that you either consciously or unconsciously employ in most of the decisions you make while you're processing audio and while you're putting tracks together. Every sound has a pressure potential, a certain threshold beyond which it starts to fall apart if it's pushed too hard. At the same time, a lot of sounds in a lot of people's projects are not pushed adequately to their full pressure potential, and so there isn't enough pressure in the sounds. Pressure is also something that comes into play with monitoring. When you're listening on your studio monitors, as many of you know by now, you really do want to be listening at talking volume, and you want to be, listening at a level which isn't going to be driving your speakers too hard, because if you turn the speakers up too loud, you hit the pressure potential of your speakers. You pass that pressure threshold, and the reliability of what your speakers are telling you starts to decrease exponentially as you turn the sound up. The same can be said for your studio's room acoustics. If you don't have a completely acoustically perfect studio, as 90% of people don't, turning your music up louder and louder and louder as you work on it will decrease the correctness of what you're hearing. So there is a pressure potential of your room where the room sound is being pushed too hard. When you put headphones on, if you turn the volume up too loud, there's a pressure potential of your ears, where your ears will actually start to fight against the incoming audio signal because the air pressure is coming into your ears with too much pressure. And so that's why, people are always saying, turn your iPhone earbuds down. You'd be amazed how many times I'll be working in headphones and I'll be straining my ears listening to something, and I'll realize that I'm doing it, and then I'll suddenly just relax my ears and suddenly I hear the sound for how it really is. So especially when it comes to listening and monitoring, you never want to be pushing anything too hard, whether it's your own ears or whether it's whatever you're listening on. There's that pressure threshold, and you really want to be careful not to overdo that. In mastering, there's a pressure threshold as well, and I think anyone who's tried to master their own stuff has hit that point of feeling like they're pushing their song up against a glass ceiling to meet industry standard loudness or that kind of thing. That is another pressure threshold, and it's more of an absolute one because you're using a mastering limiter and your sound is literally hitting this brick wall. So pressure is, it's present in everything that we do. And I think, when we look at individual sounds, we realize that every single sound has its own pressure setting that should be determined. And once again, this is just a matter usually of just thinking consciously about it. And as soon as you do, it just kind of clicks. So I'm going to show you, firstly, some of the ways that I identify pressure potential with individual sounds. And the other thing I'm going to show you is once you actually have spotted that pressure point that you're going for with a sound, how you can then use that to your advantage to put the sound under a bit of pressure, under a bit of stress, to sort of be to be really punchy or to be really impactful without overcooking, without going over that pressure threshold. So I'm just going to put my headphones on here. I have this very techno-y sounding thing. It reminds me a bit of an Australian producer, Andy Page. And this is, I've just pulled some of these loops out of my sample library, so let's have a listen to some of them. And once again, I'm not trying to be much of a virtuoso here. I'm just pulling some sounds in for a few different types of examples. So yes, very 3 a.m. boiler room techno type situation going on here. Not really the style that I'm usually known for, but you know, it works. So I'm gonna leave this in its natural state, and over here I have a copy of basically the exact same pattern that you just heard. And so with this one, we're going to explore the pressure potential of things. So you know, let me give you a quick example of how things can sort of fall over with the pressure potential. So that's got a nice bass to it. Everything's kind of bubbling along nicely. Nothing's being driven too hard at this stage. Now, when you distort something, clip something, that's the number one way that you've broken the pressure threshold. That's being pushed too hard. Pretty obvious, right? Less obvious, but that pressure threshold is still being broken. This overdrive effect is basically distorting the sound. So say I did want to make that sound a little crispy with an overdrive. What I've essentially done there is I've broken that threshold, and then I've dialed things back until I can sort of find that sweet spot where the threshold is not being pushed anymore. So let me show you that with a different kind of effect. Say if I did this with EQ, you know, once I've got my sound balanced and sounding how I want it to, say if I then wanted to come in and do some rock and roll processing to make it sound a bit more exciting, that's when I'm going to start, you know, putting this sound to the test and seeing if I can sort of push up against that pressure threshold and see how I can drive this sound without overcooking it. So I might put like a high pass filter on and then, you know, go crazy with these frequencies and boost them. That bass is distorting, so I've pushed past the pressure threshold. So we'll pull back a little bit. So I've just spiced up that sound quite considerably, but everything is still within that threshold. You know, nothing's being, and it's really about listening for all the different characteristics of the sound and asking, like, are any of these being driven too hard? Let's try with say something like a compressor now. So there's that extreme. The pressure threshold has been pushed too far. So basically what I'm always trying to do, you know, when I'm thinking about this is I'm asking myself how I can actually kind of like squish this sound, or how I can like really smash it or drive it really hard in like a rock and roll kind of way so that it rules without overcooking it. And by identifying that point at which it is overcooked, you can then sort of dial things back a little bit for transparency. Say I even wanted to put like a multi-band compressor on this, you know. Basically, I can do whatever I want to this sound as long as I'm not going over that pressure threshold. Let's try again with a snare here. Let's try some reverb, make it really big. Big decay time. So here, I've just driven this down a little bit too hard. I've just pushed it a bit further than it really wants to go. You can feel it. that works. Something that's really good for testing a track's pressure threshold is an analog model EQ. I use a lot of these Slate plugins in the How to Make Tiger Lily course. And so sometimes if I want to push the pressure threshold of a sound, and in fact, I'll do this on the kick as well, I find things that I can sort of push too far without making the whole sound break that threshold. And sometimes you can get away with a lot. So sometimes what a final mix requires of you is to really, push things like quite dramatically in a certain direction, while still remaining classy and still remaining balanced. And that's kind of the secret sauce to a really like polished sounding mix sometimes. See how that around that frequency range there definitely overcooks this snare drum. You've got things like compressor distortion. So what this is doing is it's running the snare drum through basically a sort of a controlled clipping type situation. Comp torsion, they call it. It's where the compressor is not actually compressing, but it's just driving the signal a little harder, This is a good visual indicator of sometimes when a threshold is being crossed, because this particular plugin sort of tells you when you're pushing up against that pressure threshold with this little yellow light, and then this little red light tends to show you that you've maybe pushed it a little bit too far. Turn that up a bit. I'll give you a bit more of an extreme example now with this sample here. It's got a bit of super low end. I'm going to take that out. It's got a bit of extreme high end. I'm going to take that out too. Now, this is the kind of sound that you can drive pretty hard and get away with a lot because it's not carrying the whole song. Let's go a little crazy with it. And really, any of these plugins that you want to use, the most important thing is that you just aren't driving the sound too hard. But how far can you push it before it gets to that point? Clipping the mix a little bit here, so I'll turn that down. I've driven all these sounds quite loud, so that's why it's, the whole volume of the project is going up a bit. This OTT plugin with the multi-band dynamics, it's being used by lots of people. It's just a certain bunch of multi-band compressor settings which really squish things a lot. So this sound is now really, really squished. It's super compressed, but because it's got a very high pressure threshold, you can get away with it. If you've got a punchy kick drum and you put that kind of compressor on it, you're going to blow that threshold straight away. But with a sound like this, you'd be surprised how far you can push it. And listen to how much more in your face this sound is compared to the original version. So a lot of the time, it's really about just sort of pushing things in a certain direction and seeing if you can get away with it. If ever in doubt, you can always pull back a bit on the dry wet for a bit more transparency. Last thing I'll show you is this little whooshy effect, this crash effect. So with a sound like this, I think it's worth exploring how far you can push it. Something I would do maybe is a hugely compressed reverb on it. as opposed to so this all just feels a bit more alive to me now. So the main thing I want to convey with this technique is that, you know, one of the in fact for me one of the final things that I do when finalizing a mix is, you know, going through and finding sounds that really can sort of be pushed up to the line like that and be sort of really given a kick up the backside, so to speak, to make sure that they are like sticking out as much as they can. But overall, you want to be able to keep that ease of sound. You want to be preserving that ease of sound. So every single sound that you work with, have a think about that pressure potential, and you'll be able to get a feel for it pretty quickly. Finally, there can be a bit of a misconception that high pressure equals high impact, and when people listen to a lot of high impact songs, you know, it might be like some crazy dubstep, you know, something with, you know, a really powerful song, that impact is coming from pressure being applied on things, and that's not necessarily always the case. In fact, as we've explored in the last video, sometimes that high impact is actually being created more by a sense of ease of the sounds. That said, when you can identify that pressure threshold, that potential of pressure, then you can start to use it for creative, advantageous effect. In the next video, we're going to explore the concept of clarity, so stay tuned for that.